Sometimes I really don't know why I choose to speak on a certain thing. I told Wanda yesterday, I said, I really don't know why I'm speaking about this today. And she said, well, you don't need to know why you're speaking about it. It is what it is. So I hope it makes sense to you. I like old Electrolux vacuum cleaners. We have 12. And they all work. And that's what I use. So for my birthday, somebody gave me a book on the history of vacuum cleaners. And now you would think, who would want to read about that? But it was one of the most fascinating books I've read in a long time. Simply because the guy that wrote it was smart enough to weave it in with the things going on in the United States at that time. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it like this. I used to think about it like this. So my grandmother on my father's side was born back in the 1800s. And so was my great-grandmother on my mother's side. And I used to think of the changes that they saw in their life. You just think how life changed in the United States from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. People, machine-made textiles became available, machine-made furniture became available, and people went from having just the basics of what they had to have in their houses to having more than the basics, to having decorative stuff. They had rugs, and they had electricity, and life completely changed during that time. And it was fascinating as I read this book as he went through and detailed all the changes in the household stuff and all of the just life in general through that time from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And that is the time period that the vacuum cleaner was born in, as you can imagine. That's when rugs started coming into use, and that's when machine woven rugs started coming into use, and they were cheap enough to where people could afford them. And then they got them in the house and they got filthy. They didn't have any way to clean them, but they got outside and beat them out. So it was a fascinating look at American society and household from the household perspective. And when I was thinking about that, I started thinking about Christianity over that time period too. And that was the time period when seeds were planted in Christianity that would bear fruit and on later in our lifetimes, and we would see many different changes in Christianity over our own lifetimes. And then I thought, that's nothing new. Christianity has always changed. You just ride around town and see the churches of all the different denominations. Each one of those denominations started when somebody came up with a new idea and they broke off and went off over here and started their Baptist or their Free Will Baptist or their Primitive Baptist or the Methodist or the Free Methodist or the Missionary Methodist or something. So it's always morphed. It's been like a hydrant, just growing into different directions all during its history. We know about some of the changes, but a lot we don't know. Some of the changes in Christianity came very early in its history, and there are scholars now that are working in that field in the very early years of Christianity. And I look at some of their work occasionally, and I find it interesting, but there just has not been enough to survive from the early days of Christianity for us to know much about. But we can look at changes that occurred more recently, like starting in the 1800s into the early 1900s and on. And this will hopefully get us to better understand today. Now, Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." So what was he talking about? You shall know the truth. The word there in the Bible for truth is a word that connotes unveiling something. That it connotes that appearances hide reality. And when you look at appearances, you don't see reality. You see something that deceives you. And so the biblical word for truth there connotes pulling back a veil. So you can see behind the veil of reality and see truth with a capital T. See true reality. And Christianity has traditionally maintained that God is the one who takes that veil off for us. That we are not able ourselves to take that veil off. God does that. And when God takes that veil off, then we see behind appearances. And the way this has seemed to have been done is through Jesus. Through the event of what happened in Jesus. At least some of the veil has been taken off. And that allows us to see beyond appearances to true reality. But you know, none of us were alive back during the time of Jesus. And so we have to have something to tell us what happened back then. That has traditionally been seen as the Bible in Christianity. But be sure and realize that we do not worship the Bible, nor do we take the Bible as an end in and of itself. We look at the Bible as that which points us back to Jesus, that what tells us what happened. Now this is a complicated thing, and I know it's hard to understand, so I thought it would be easier if I just broke it down to one aspect of truth and talk about that. And that this principle applies to truth as a whole. So I want to talk about the aspect of truth known as morality. That's right and wrong. Now we've talked about right and wrong in here before in the context of why some things are regarded as right and some things are regarded as wrong. We've talked about in here before whether morality is absolute. And that means whether or not there are moral principles that stand for all ages, for all people, no matter where you are and what time. And we saw that Christians, and even most non-Christians, for the most part agree that morality is absolute. And that means there's a certain set of moral rights and wrongs that are right and wrong for me and us in the United States. They're also right and wrong for people in Africa or in Australia or wherever you go. They're right and wrong for us today in 2026. They were right and wrong for people in the year 200. And if the world lasts to 5,000, they'll be right and wrong in 5,000. So that's what it means to say morality is absolute. So how do we know what those moral principles are? Well, for most of Christian history, Christians said we know because God tells us what they are. If you're a Protestant, you would believe that God tells you through the Bible. If you were a Roman Catholic, you could believe that God told you through the Bible or through the church hierarchy, because the church hierarchy would receive that from God. So any way you look at it, whether it's from the Bible or the church hierarchy or whatever, it came from God, and the way God used those, the foundational document of the Bible, to tell us these things. And so God used the Bible as the foundational document to tell us these things. So we have seen in our lifetimes how morality has become a source of disagreement, especially in terms of sexuality and things like that. What is right and wrong has not been agreed to. But even through all those disagreements, we have seen Christians, at least, most Christians, go back to the Bible. They start with the Bible. Now, one may go down this path and get to this destination, another may go down that path, or another may go down that path. But they start with the Bible. in most forms of Christianity. However, that is no longer true. That changed, and the Bible got removed as the starting point. Whereas traditionally in Christianity, the griping and the fussing and the disagreements came not from whether or not we were going to reject the Bible, but how we interpreted it. Today they're coming from rejecting it. And then the idea also developed that we know truth, including morality, not because God tells us, but because society discovers it. And that has been a sea change within Christianity. Now, to understand how that happened, I want us to go back to the late 1800s. We see several things happening then that are of interest to us. One is that science has burst on the scene, and people are enthralled with science. It is capturing the public imagination. And we've talked about this before, how science was telling people things like the parting of the Red Sea, Noah's Ark, the Tower of Babel, the walls of Jericho, the virgin birth of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. All that stuff could not have happened because it violates the laws of science, and we know that doesn't happen. And so science started telling people those things are myths. That's one thing going on. Another thing going on that's of interest to us back then is that at this time in the history of the United States, there was a lot of prosperity in this country among a small little group of people concentrated in big cities, the big industrialists and the big bankers, the monopolists, the robber barons, as some called them. And they were in general concentrated in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago. They were a class of super rich, worldly, cosmopolitan people, and they were so rich and powerful they were prominent not only here, but also in other parts of the world. And it was very important to these people that they be seen as the upper crust of society, sophisticated, educated, worldly, citizens of the world. Everybody was talking about science, so that's what they talked about. After all, they wanted to follow the times, what the sophisticated people were talking about. So that's another factor in society. Another factor in society was that this was not all that long since the Civil War. Slavery had been a big issue in the country not all that long ago. And now practically everybody was agreeing that slavery was wrong, but yet the Bible accepts it. And the Bible even explicitly tells slaves to be subject to their masters. Another thing happening during this time was that women were beginning to demand equality with men. But yet there are clearly places in the Bible that subjugate women to men. In addition to that, what's known as the fundamentalist movement was gaining traction in many denominations. It was a reaction against seeing the world through the eyes of science. There were 5 fundamentals that you had to follow if you wanted to be a real Christian in their view. And so you had all this stuff going on in society that no longer fit with the scientific worldview, this fundamentalism. And it became associated with backwoods pigs. And Christianity itself became associated with backwoods pigs. It seemed so old-fashioned. The cutting edge of society, the crust of society, was moving in different directions. These wealthy people in these big cities wanted to be seen as educated, sophisticated citizens of the world. And that's when a man named Harry Emerson Fosdick came on the scene, one of the most influential figures in American Christianity. he was a pastor in New York City at places like Madison Avenue Baptist Church and First Presbyterian Church, Manhattan. And you better believe that people like us didn't go to First Presbyterian Church in Manhattan. It was those great, big, wealthy, filthy, rich people. And Fosdick caught the attention of a man named John B. Rockefeller, one of the richest, arguably the richest man in the United States at that time. And Rockefeller decided he wanted to build a church in New York City, a church for people like him, a church for these wealthy, sophisticated, educated, upper crust of society. He didn't want it to be attached to any one denomination. And he had heard about Fosdick, and so he turned to Fosdick for help. Rockefeller built that church. It still stands today. Riverside Church in Manhattan. And he got Fosdick to be the first pastor there. And so Harry Emerson Fosdick was the pastor to the richest, most powerful people in the United States. And he understood the dilemma these people faced. He said, I want to be both a serious Christian and an intelligent monk. So what did they do? They didn't want to seem like backwater hicks. So they looked to Charles Darwin and his theory on evolution. Darwin came up with the idea that life evolved from single-cell organisms all the way up and then became human beings. And supposedly, human beings were supposed to be the goal of it all. So they borrowed Darwin's ideas about evolution of life and applied them to society. They developed the idea that just as life evolved from very simple primitive forms up to the goal of human beings, so society would evolve from very primitive barbaric forms up to the goal of society of New York City in the 1930s. And so they regarded themselves and their society as the goal for which all development in society, they were it. They were the pinnacle. That's what it was all leading to then. And then they looked at the Bible and they said, well, we sort of feel sorry for these people that wrote the Bible because after all, they weren't as developed as we are. It was a lower form of society, not fully evolved. And so they sort of felt sorry for them people, you know, they're sort of undeveloped and uneducated. They're not like us, so we really can't blame them. But what we've got in the Bible is just the ramblings of these dumb people. With them, though, society had reached its apex. After ages and ages of primitive idiots trying to figure out truth and trying to figure out morality, they were the first people in human history to know truth. And it wasn't because God revealed it to them, it's because they discovered it. They discovered it. It was because they were so advanced and so developed and so evolved that they discovered it themselves. They did not need God to tell them the truth. They did not need anything to tell them anything. They were smart and evolved, and they could come up with it themselves. Truth and the absolutes of right and wrong had been there all along, but it was only then they finally discovered them. All other attempts to know truth had failed because people were too primitive. Their generation was the first to be sophisticated enough to know truth and know how things really are. And so that's when the Bible began to be looked at as the product of ancient, rambling idiots. And that's when Christianity as a religion itself began to be looked at as just a stepping stone upon the evolution of society. The beginnings of all of this are found when Christianity first began to confront the claims of science. And this issue, how Christianity reacted to the claims of science, has had more effect on Christianity than anything else within the past 150 years. It led to revolutionary changes in Christianity. These changes were so big that you can't even begin to overstate them. They can't be overstated. They were huge. By the 1950s, this very kind of attitude that I've talked about today was beginning to gain acceptance in mainline Christianity. It was beginning to be taught in seminary. It was beginning to be held by the upper echelon church officials in the mainline denomination. And then you begin to hear a new term that they call Christ myth. Christ myth. Now the term Christ myth has two different connotations depending on who's using it. In one, it can refer to the belief that Jesus was just a regular person, just like we are. It did something that the Romans didn't like. And so they killed him. And after they killed him, a group of his followers got together and they sort of developed some myths and legends about him and went around spreading all this stuff, and pretty soon this religion was born around. Or the Christ myth might refer to the belief that Jesus never existed at all, that the whole thing was made up. And so in this idea that some people sometime in the 200 or 300s got together and made up this story about some man that was supposedly born and then crucified and all this, that, and the other back 200 or 300 years ago, and they passed this off and made a religion. This is reflective of a debate that goes on today among some people. The mythists are the ones who believe the whole thing is made up. The historicists are those who believe there was an actual man, just a man, that got killed, and then later the beliefs grew up around him, the religion of Christianity. Now I know that some of you have encountered the term Christ myth in your readings before because you've asked me about it. So this is where it came from. All this rambling on that I've done for the past 20 minutes is where it all came from. But what I wanted to say, and what the point really is, Christianity is not a religion of things people thought up. Christianity is not a religion of things people sat down and made up, stories that people sat down and created. Christianity is not a religion that results from the development of society. I really believe, truly deep in my heart, that Christianity is a religion that hinges on a real historical event that happened 2,000 years ago. It was a time when God intervened in the world by coming here as Jesus. And so the basis of Christianity is not human understanding, not human thought, not human development. The basis of Christianity is the unique time in human history when God himself came here as Jesus. And so the event of Jesus, that is the basis of Christianity. And don't let anybody tell you that it is just a made-up story.